So yes, let's get started. Hello, everyone. If for some reason you don't know me, my name is Carl Skooglund. Welcome to Treasure Hunt. So as you probably know, we're here to explore the teachings of Buddhism's early tradition, as they're recorded in what's known as the Pali Canon, which is the collection of Buddhism's earliest known texts. These texts, they give us the best chance at understanding what the Buddha himself and his earliest followers thought and taught about how to lead a human life. And then the intention of this class is to put those teachings into practice for ourselves. We've been exploring a text called the Sāmaññaphala Sutta, which gets translated as the fruits of recluseship or the fruits of the contemplative life. This sutta is the second in what's called the Digha Nikaya, a collection of long discourses. And in it, we find a variation of how the elements of practice come together to form what could be called a gradual path. So we've been mining, you might say, this 2,500-year-old teaching, digging past the technical language, some of the obscure concepts, and trying to find some nuggets, the gold that might not be readily apparent, if you were to just pick up this text randomly and try to read it by yourself. We'll finish off the teaching today, but looking back to the beginning, the context for this teaching is that a new king, Ajatasattu, has just taken power by killing his father. Now the king is feeling ill at ease because of his actions, and he's seeking someone, anyone who he says can bring peace to my mind. The king's doctor happens to be nearby. He refers him, you might say, to the Buddha, who's staying in a mango grove just outside the city. The king sets out in grand royal splendor with 500 elephants. And with what we can imagine was quite a commotion, the king comes upon the Buddha with 1,250 of his followers, it says, who by contrast are serene as a calm lake. So right at the beginning, this teaching creates a stark contrast in which we have, on the one hand, the unbridled worldly ambition of a king, Ajatasattu, who has just killed his father in order to ascend to power. On the other hand, we have the Buddha, who relinquished worldly ambition. He was a prince, in fact, himself. The Buddha relinquished this worldly ambition in favor of discovering the ultimate freedom of heart and mind, awakening, unbinding. When they meet, the king asks the Buddha, what are the benefits of your practice? To which the Buddha lays out this gradual path. And if you have the outline that I emailed, it might help to follow along. So the first step is to go forth, which involves the intention of setting aside conventional ways of finding satisfaction in life, and also setting aside conventional ways of resolving our difficulties. And the key is that we search inwardly rather than relying on the whims of the external environment. Next, we establish a healthy ethical framework, the root of which is said to be that we're conscientious, kind, and sympathetic. Third, we do what is known as guard the senses, which means that we become careful about what we make out of the experiences that arise for us by way of the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Remember that there are 6 senses in Buddhism. Fourth, we compose our minds by maintaining clear comprehension of our physical activities. Right? This helps keep the mind helps keep our attention from flying around, helps keep it from wandering. Fifth, we encourage ourselves to be content in our material state, so that instead of being picky, hard to please, we become easy to please. Now, these first 5 facets create an environment in the mind, you might say, in which we're in a position to engage in the next aspect of the path, which is to let go of what are called the 5 hindrances. The 5 hindrances being attraction, irritation, dullness, worry, and doubt. And by setting aside these mental, emotional disturbances, which takes no small amount of investigation and insight, our minds are then able to settle in, and experience the non-worldly pleasure of a concentrated, unified mind, which is the characteristic of the 4 jhanas. And this peace and equanimity of heart and mind, this what's called settled, bright, and malleable mind. This is the 7th aspect of the path. And a settled, bright, and malleable mind puts us in a position to come into insight, which is the 8th aspect of this gradual path. Now, I want to pause here and offer up a quick reference to another sutta that I think is appropriate and also helpful. It's a section from another collection of teachings called the Anguttara Nikaya, or the Numbered Discourses. And this teaching is referred to as the Goldsmith Sutta. In this teaching, the Buddha describes how a skilled goldsmith does a combination of 3 things when working with gold. First, he knows when to heat it up by blowing on the fire beneath it. He knows when to cool it down by sprinkling it with water. And he also knows when to just sit back and look on. Just sit back and watch it. Now, this is important. The text says he doesn't do just one of these things. Right? The sutta says that he does each one from time to time. Right? He knows when to do each one. And as a result, the gold would thus become, it said, malleable, wieldy, luminous, pliant, and properly fit for work. And then he can make the gold into whatever he wants. So I think you might be able to tell where this is leading. The Buddha then sets up an analogy in which a skilled practitioner engages in exertion, serenity, and or equanimity, again, from time to time. Exertion, the text says, is like blowing on the fire to heat up the gold. Serenity, or concentration, is like cooling down the gold by sprinkling water on it. And equanimity is just like looking on, seeing what's happening, being patient with the process. It says that the skilled practitioner, doesn't do just one of these things, right? We don't just exert, we don't just relax, we don't just sit back and watch. We do each from time to time. So part of being skilled craftspeople of our own mind is that we know, for ourselves over time with practice, by experimenting, when each of these 3 actions makes sense. And the point is that it takes insight, it takes wisdom to understand how to settle the mind, how to bring it into concentration, into jhana. You may remember this quote from the Dhammapada, verse 372 from the last class. Part of it says, there is no wisdom without concentration. And there is no concentration without wisdom. As this Goldsmith text shows, the Buddha loved images of skilled craftspeople, someone who over time gets really good at something. And again, as goldsmiths of our own minds, we can shape our mind and do things with it that we'd like to do. In the Buddha's path of practice, the thing to do with this bright, malleable mind is to direct it, to incline it to insight, to understanding, which is the 8th aspect of this gradual path. One particular thing to point out about the Goldsmith teaching is that it says that what we want to do with with our minds being, bright, malleable, workable, concentrated, it says that what we want to do is bring an end to the asavas. Now, the asavas may be a new word, a new concept for a number of you, and I'll say more about them in just a little bit. But for now, just to say that the ending of the asavas is also what our sutta points us to, as its culmination, along with understanding the Four Noble Truths. But before we get to the asavas, the Sāmaññaphala Sutta lays out quite a wild ride, you might say, of supernormal powers. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on them, but just to put this into context, this range of powers is not something that the Buddha consistently talked about. He seemed, I would say, to refer to these powers only in certain contexts, almost as a way to generate interest in the path for certain kinds of people, for whom this would matter. In reality, we could skip over these and take a direct route to the asavas. Again, the culmination of this gradual path. Nevertheless, here's the list that the Buddha describes for the king, which happens in the text right after the section on insight. So this first supernormal power is knowledge of the mind-made body. This means that you can duplicate yourself in physical form. Second is the knowledge of modes of supernormal power, which means that you can vanish and reappear, walk through walls, walk on water, travel to other realms of existence. Third is knowledge of the divine ear, which means you can hear things at great distances. Fourth is knowledge encompassing the minds of others. This means that you can basically read minds. You can be telepathic and empathic. And like I said, some people could be impressed by this. And at this time and at other times in history, miracle working was just part of any guru's repertoire. And so in our particular case, it almost seems like the Buddha, he's checking the boxes, so to speak, verifying for the king, yes, we can do this kind of stuff too. Now, it's understandable that our Western minds, with our scientific approach to knowledge, that we write these four modes off in knee-jerk fashion, as we do all forms of myth and superstition. And as I said, we could skip over these. They're not essential for the path. And yet, I want to point out that you can read certain contemporary accounts of skilled practitioners, and it's clear that something unusual is going on. One example we can find is in the biography of a woman from India. Her name was Dipa Ma. And the biography of her that I'm familiar with is called Knee Deep in Grace. Dipa Ma taught in Calcutta, and she died fairly recently, 1989. Now, her life story in general is interesting, and I do recommend the book, but the point here is that Dipa Ma apparently had extremely strong concentration. And as a result, Dipa Ma herself was very casual about it, but it was reported that she could duplicate herself. She could disappear and reappear, read minds, and visit other realms. And these were actually reported, by Western practitioners. It's also estimated that she was what's called a non-returner, which is the third stage of awakening. The fourth of which is arhatship, which is complete awakening. And all I want to say about this is that let's be careful about closing off possibilities for what the human mind is capable of. Just to the extent that we might unwillingly or unwittingly rather close off the possibility for complete awakening. Right? We might unwittingly write off awakening as a myth. The next two aspects of the sequence in the gradual path here, I broke them out in the outline that I sent because unlike the supernormal powers, these two aspects actually are mentioned frequently. They're mentioned in the set of occurrences that happened just prior to the Buddha's awakening. First is the knowledge of the recollection of past lives. So it's commonly said in the text that on the night of his awakening, the soon-to-be Buddha had a vision of his past lives. A vision of all the beings that he'd been and what he had done. The second of this pair is knowledge of the divine I, as it's called. With this, the soon-to-be Buddha realized the conditioned nature of experience as it manifests in the rising and passing away of beings. He saw that experiences and that people's lives arise and pass away according to causes and conditions. The text says he understands how beings fare according to their karma. This is what the tradition refers to as dependent origination. Now, I just started reading a book called Sapiens. And I sometimes think this book, it's been on the New York Times bestseller list for quite a while. I recommend it also. It's about the history and development of this species of ours. And, deep history. And I sometimes think that with these two recollections, these two visions that the Buddha had, that this ancient history of ours is what the Buddha was tapping into, an appreciation of the depth of conditioning, that plays out in our lives, that arises in our lives, due to our long history of just trying to stay safe, stay fed, and to propagate. And no small part of this is, fitting in well within our social networks, fitting in. So again, according to the teaching of the goldsmith, the reason that we make the mind malleable, wieldy, and luminous, pliant, and properly concentrated is for the ending of what are called the asavas. So we could, if we want to draw a straight line from the jhanas to the asavas, to this last facet of this version of the path. Now, some of you may recall that the Sabbasava Sutta was actually the very first text that we studied when we started this class at the end of 2018. Andy Olinsky, whose curriculum we're following, recommended it as being the first text that we should study within the Middle discourses, the Majjhima Nikaya. In our current text, we have a 4-part formula that's applied to both the asavas and to dukkha. The formula refers to their existence, their origin, their cessation, and the path leading to their cessation. So let's talk through this. I know that I haven't yet described the asavas, but I'm building up. I'm building up the anticipation. But just to say, in Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, asavas gets translated as canker. The section gets translated, in Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, the section in the sutta gets translated as knowledge of the destruction of the cankers. Canker is a bit of a weird word, and I'll talk about that later, but here is the text from the sutta. When his mind is thus concentrated, pure and bright, unblemished, free from defects, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, he directs and inclines it to the knowledge of the destruction of the cankers, the asavas. He understands as it really is. This is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. This is the Four Noble Truths, right? Next come the asavas, the cankers. He understands as it really is. These are the cankers. He understands as it really is. This is the origin of the cankers. This is the cessation of the cankers. This is the way leading to the cessation of the cankers. So, two things to address right away. First, what's the idea behind destruction? What's with this idea of destroying something, and what, of course, is a canker? Now, this may not come off as a very inspiring or illuminating way to end this teaching. So here's where a little translating and context setting is helpful, I hope. I'm going to do my best to throw you a lifeline in case you're experiencing a little, or maybe even a lot of aversion, or drowning in a perception of what the heck is going on here. So again, the Pali word that Bhikkhu Bodhi is translating as canker is asava, and I'm going to set aside canker and keep using the Pali word asava in this talk. Just to say, the asavas are a concept that don't get a lot of airtime in current Dharma circles. But it's interesting, in the Buddha's mind, they were the reason that we stay caught in samsara. This aimless wandering. The literal translation of the Pali word asava is flow. And asava could mean to flow out or to flow in. Sometimes I think of it simply as movement. Other translations of asava that we encounter are taint or corruption. One translation is effluent, like the toxic waste that comes out of an industrial plant. I've seen the term fermentation, which evokes the idea of something churning, bubbling, stewing. The translations, I think, attempt to characterize the effects that the asavas have on the mind, which is that they cause harm. And this language is much stronger than saying something like hindrance, right? Speaking for myself in terms of their character and felt effect, I've come to translate asava as compulsion. All right, a compulsion that causes us to wander. So asava is a flow of movement, a compulsion that causes harm. So that's the first question, what is it that we're talking about? The second question the second concern is that we tend not to like the idea of destroying something within ourselves, right? One thing is that the idea just reeks of aversion, right? And aversion is something we're supposed to abandon, right? And also these days we're much more attuned to ideas, of welcoming, accepting, allowing. We don't want to push anything away. Well, when we encounter a teaching that recommends that we end certain things that are going on in our minds, we might be inclined to perceive it as conflicting with, the more contemporary goal of psychological integration. And when we hear that we should end something that's going on inside of us, we might see it as a kind of emotional suppression, as creating unhealthy divisions within us. And here's the crux of the matter, I think. Whether or not you agree with the approach, whether it feels right or not, the idea in the early tradition is that there are some kinds of activities that go on in these hearts and minds of ours that work against our well-being. In the early tradition, it's not a matter of accepting these activities. I think it's so important to understand the point of view that the early texts take. These things that we're talking about, they're not things. They're not nouns, they're not parts of our being. Instead, these things that we're talking about, they're verbs, they're activities. They're karma. They're actions that we engage in. And you might say that karma, our own karma, is the sum total of our actions. Karma is about grooves. It's about channels that we've dug within ourselves, or that evolution, in fact, has dug for us. What we're talking about is patterns and inclinations that we've built up within us. Indeed, what those billions of years of evolution has built up within us. So in the early tradition, there's no kernel of being that sits static within us and is an integral part of a self. Again, this is such an important thing, I think, to consider and to reflect upon each for ourselves, because if we don't make this shift in perspective, this shift in perception, then a lot of the Buddha's early teachings, a lot of what is distinctive about them is going to be inaccessible at best, or at worst, it's going to feel offensive or just plain wrong. So, but that's really all the early texts are saying, is let's not act in certain ways that cause ourselves harm. So that's that. And at this point, what are the asavas? Thank you for your patience. There are three. There's the asava of sense desire. There's the asava of becoming or existence. And then there's the asava of ignorance. So here we go. The asava of sense desire is about the mind flowing to, being compelled by the external sense pleasures that come to us by way of the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. As you all know, there are global industries devoted to satisfying these compulsions. Think Coca-Cola. And by framing sense desire as an asava, the Buddha is asking us to consider or reconsider the ways in which we find pleasure in life. the ways in which we make ourselves happy. The idea behind the path is that more and more gradually, over time, we redirect ourselves away from external sources of happiness and rely more and more on internal sources of happiness, the kinds of happiness that we can make within our own minds. Like goodwill, like jhana, for example, just as two examples. So the second asava is what's called becoming, or existence, as it's translated in Bhikkhu Bodhi's version. Bhava is the Pali word. On one level, this one is about how we're drawn from one life to the next. We wander from one life to the next. But more immediately, this one points to our tendency, to our compulsion, to create worlds of experience. And then to live out certain lives within those worlds. And paired up with that is that we create certain kinds of identities, certain self-images of ourselves within those worlds of experience. This is such a fundamental compulsion of the mind, I think. A fundamental flow to create worlds of experience and create identities and self-images within those worlds. Right? We want to get on to the next thing. Perhaps it's a new job, someplace that we aren't right now. Get into a better relationship, reach a certain stage in life. And within those worlds, we want to create certain pleasing self-images. Images in our own minds. And we also want to be seen by other people in certain pleasing ways. Wanting to be seen, understood, perceived in certain ways within our social relations, within our social fabric. Going back to that book, Sapiens, it might help to realize, this is not a personal problem. It's deeply evolutionary. But to offer up an alternative, here's another passage from the Dhammapada. This is verse 91, which points, I think, to a healthy non-grasping and agility of mind. It says, the mindful apply themselves. They don't amuse themselves in any abode. They don't amuse themselves in any abode. Like swans flying from a lake, they abandon home after home. So that's the second asava. The third asava is that of ignorance. Now, in the Buddhist context, ignorance doesn't refer to the fact that we don't know everything. Instead, it's about how we don't clue into the Four Noble Truths. Dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the end of dukkha, and the path leading to the end of dukkha. And when I taught kids a while back, the way I used to frame ignorance is that it's a fundamental confusion about what causes suffering, and it's a fundamental confusion about how we're to be free, how we're to make ourselves happy. Fundamentally, as I've said quite a bit, we humans tend to perceive that the causes of our suffering are out there in the external environment. And on the flip side, we tend to try to seek happiness out there, in the external environment. The mind flows out, wandering, sniffing around the external environment, feeding off the external environment. This maybe ironically takes us back to the very first facet of this path, going forth. which is fundamentally is meant to counteract, this ignorance, so that we look within, both for the source of our happiness and for the end of our suffering, for the end of dukkha. So I'd like to pause here and offer a little chance for the dust to settle a little bit. Knowing that I might have kicked up a little dust, a little conceptual dust. And I'd like to offer us a time to, sit for a little while. So with that in mind, if you'd like to adjust your posture, please feel free to do so. Close your eyes if you like. So here's a chance to let go of my words and go forth, go inward. And you might start by finding your body, finding your breathing. Compose your mind, compose your attention within your body, within your breathing. And to help with that, you might try to pay close attention to those physical sensations that confirm for you that you do have a body. How is it that you know in these moments that you have a body? Compose your mind within those sensations, within that knowledge. And then being a little more specific within these bodily sensations, try to pay close attention to those physical sensations. Confirm for you that you're breathing. How is it that you know that you're breathing? Compose your mind, settle your heart. within this breathing body. This is a fundamental intention of our practice. We practice becoming happy by having these hearts and minds settled, peaceful, composed. See if that's possible for you right now in these moments. You may find that even though one part of your mind, one part of your heart would like to settle down, values peace, you might find that another part of the mind wants to wander. It wants to move. It feels compelled by something. And when this happens, just be patient. Noticing this is another fundamental intention of the practice, to notice when it happens. Be clear for yourself when this happens. Be clear for yourself about this tendency to flow, this compulsion to flow. And then, as best as you can, to let go of that compulsion. To let go of the identification. And instead to be free. Again and again, breathe in, feel this body. Breathe out, relax this body, relax this heart. Let go of this compulsion to move, compulsion to wander. Nearing the end of a formal practice period, you might find it helpful to try to maintain the intention of maintaining peace and clarity as you open your eyes as we proceed. So I hope that was a helpful break, a helpful reboot, perhaps. So to wrap up, just want to read one of the last sections of the sutta. This is the one that points to liberation. This is the text. Knowing and seeing, his mind is liberated. Liberated from the asava, sense desire, from the asava of existence, from the asava of ignorance. When it is liberated, the knowledge arises. It is liberated. He understands. Destroyed his birth. The holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no further thing beyond this. And then also at the end of this sutta, the king Ajatasattu proclaims himself to be a lay follower of the Buddha. Interestingly, and you may have been wondering about this, since the very first part of the sutta, the king actually admits what he's done to the Buddha. He verbalizes that he's killed his father. And then he says, let the exalted one acknowledge my transgression as a transgression for the sake of my restraint in the future. And then the Buddha accepts his admission, and then they part ways. So that's the end of this one, the Sāmaññaphala Sutta. And just to say, we've covered a lot of ground with this one. I appreciate your patience in moving along with this. But I think the simple idea behind this gradual path is that what it says is that step by step, we create the conditions within ourselves, for the unfolding, for the blossoming of serenity, for understanding, and for freedom. Again, there's been a lot here, but I hope you've found some things that are of value, at least a few things to reflect on and to work with in your practice. So thank you for your attention. And we now have a good amount of time for questions, comments, and perhaps a little time to talk about what interests you have, for what might be next, as we finish out the year. I'd love to hear from you all.
Carl, the whole series on this sutta has been magnificent, really outstanding, so informative. The meditations have been lovely. This may come as a surprise. I'd be happy to start it all over again. There was so much information to process. I did so much extra reading and revisiting the sutta and looking back at my notes for others who've done this, you probably won't want to go back to it again, but I hope at some time, maybe in the next year, you'll revisit this one for sort of newbies like me who've come on board in the last, last year. Because this was really spectacular. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you for saying. I'm grateful, especially being a new person, that you were open to such a complex thing. I really appreciate your openness to that.
Thanks, Carl. I look forward to going back and finding all the recordings.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it very insightful with the pause for meditation. I was reflecting on the asavas during the meditation and noticing that compulsion. It reminds me so much of like recovery from compulsive overeating and process of meditation, of noticing thoughts and just don't fight them. I don't have to make myself not think. I just set them aside. Here, puppy, sit over here. And so one of the things in recovery from addictive processes, compulsive processes is to notice when you notice. So when you first awake, like in meditation, oh, I woke up. So even if it's 2 years after the event, and gradually endeavor to notice sooner. And so I was taking that into meditation practice today, and it was very interesting how I could notice as a thought somewhere earlier in the arising of the thought, and then it's like, oh, and I don't have to think about the thought that I thought. I can just let it, whatever the process is anyway, it just I got this new insight around it today because the teaching and the practice combined together like that.
Great.
That it's like, oh, okay, so it's not that I'm trying to make thoughts not happen. Not that I haven't thought this thought or had this insight before, but it's different today. It's like all I have to do is notice the compulsion and choose to not follow it. And it's like, oh my gosh, or oh my goddess. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah, I didn't want to be too literal with it, but I thought that the way I tried to frame the instructions was that it was a natural pointing back to the asavas. I mean, they can seem so foreign and abstract, but when you sit down to practice, it at least for me, it is so much of what experience is about.
Well, it exactly did that for me, Carl. It took what I could understand cognitively and to a certain degree experientially and really anchored it in my experience.
Great.
So that was very skillfully done. Thank you.
Great.
Carl?
Yes, Jesse.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more from your perspective on, one of the great kind of like, there's so many like little, nuggets of the teachings that you can really dig into and contemplate. And sometimes I do that with the notion of the mind being one of the six senses, with thoughts being the object of the, of the sense of that sense. And, what the implications of that are, because in something like sense desire, we normally think of that in terms of our five worldly senses, but when you apply that to the sense of the mind, what does it mean in that context? And sometimes I, try to look at it through the lens of like, my mind likes to think. It craves thinking, in a certain way generates pleasant vedana, that it feels good to be solving a problem or something. So I wonder, if you've thought about that, kind of what, how you work with that as the mind is one of the six senses.
Yeah, that it can be a real game changer to think of the mind as a sixth sense, and especially having the thoughts become something that are not encompassing of reality any more than seeing a tree. That seeing a tree with our eye has to encompass our reality, if that makes sense. We have a thought about something, and if we get caught inside of it, it's a bubble that defines us. But if we can look at the arising of a thought with no more personal identification than when the eye sees a tree, or whatever it is, smells a smell, there may be desire for that particular smell or a desire for that thought, but it's a little different. I'm not sure if I'm describing it too well, but if you can apply that non-identification with thoughts and emotions in the same way that we can apply it with external objects, I think that's another part of really the possibilities of seeing the mind as a sixth sense.
it's a complex.
That's how I verbalize it at the moment, but I'm sure other people have had experience with this and could weigh in as well. So.
It's just to say one more word about it. It leads to a certain tension in the teachings, because when you see your thoughts as something separate from your mind, it can lead you into this like dualistic thinking, which, and not to get too philosophical, but it's, which is again something to be avoided, but to kind of work with it, you kind of have to see, well, this is something that's arising. It's natural, but it's not. It is there. There is some gap, between the thought and the mind that's perceiving the thought.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, it's certainly an area that I try to work. I mean, I think it's one of the great, areas of practice is to develop that new relationship with our thoughts, and different teachings, I think, approach it from different angles. And sometimes they can seem contradictory, but I think that's just part of the path.
Yeah, this idea that that can be set up. You mentioned the term duality. It can be perceived as if there's awareness or consciousness that is aware of an object, and therefore that sets up a duality. And it does make sense that to make distinctions, but I think maybe the way to bypass the notion that this is about creating dualities is that it's more about creating non-identification. Because the part of the mind that knows the thing is not any more of a me than the object that it's seeing. Awareness is impersonal as well. The awareness and the object are not the same thing, but neither one is an object. Again, it's processes, right? To get back to this noun verb framework. Awareness is one process, and all the things that awareness is aware of, they're processes as well. This may be a little bit of a conceptual hall of mirrors, but I think that's actually kind of the framework that gets set up by this tradition.
Thanks. That's a great way of putting it.
What that resonates up for me, Jesse, is pointing back to the last part of Carl's teaching on the with the three asavas, the sense desire, that the antidote, or whatever, if you will, is the redirecting the ways we seek pleasure. So I also have a mind that finds many different kinds of thinking processes pleasurable. And so what rose up for me as I heard that discussion was, just like I don't have to make the taste of a mango be not pleasurable, or the scent of a lilac be not pleasurable. It's the not getting swept up fully, so immersed in, and then compulsively following like an LSD trip or whatever, that trying to stay in that desire, or yeah, Carl did the identification piece. Anyway, I'm just digesting this new concept. Thanks.
Emily.
Thank you, Carl. I was, during the meditation, I was very taken with the idea the idea of ignorance as defined by looking externally for happiness. And there's a little bit of confusion in that I love being with people, and so I seek externalizing in that happiness. I don't think it's banned or anything, but it's a compulsion.
Mm-hmm.
And I really appreciate these times when we're all together. I would have to say I could do the Satipatthana Sutta anytime. That's so dense, and it was so great to have this follow it, because I have been working with the dependent origination ideas, and just looking at things on that, with that perspective, to work to dispel my own ignorances, my desire to create a narrative, etc. So, yeah, externalizing happiness, that desire to, well, particularly as mentioned with the Delta variant, bringing up the numbers again, you know, the sadness that I have about other people being ignorant, and I don't know how ignorant I'm being by just wanting to be with others, you know. So that's my commentary.
I guess maybe one thing by way of response is this idea that our path is gradual. You know, to jump to the end and want to be free and say, "Oh, I don't need anybody." That's perhaps not too skillful. You know, trying to force ourselves to be free in a certain kind of way when, you know, parts of our mind were not built that way. Parts of our mind were just, you know, we need the companionship, you know, and even this path is built on, you know, the Buddha said, you know, friendship is the most important part of the path, you know, having good companions. But I think the direction is to rely less on certain things that we might be compelled, you know, that we might gravitate towards in an unhealthy way. It doesn't mean that we don't smell the lilacs, but we don't rely on lilacs, right? But it's also good to rely on our friends, you know, while we're not yet, you know, fully there.
Yeah, I can't imagine not relying on my Sangha.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful for this way together. And you're right, I wanted freedom immediately.
I hear you with that, Emily, and it reminds me of some of a repeated part of prayer from my local Buddhist temple. It says, "Until awakening, I'll take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha." And I don't know what the difference in life experience it would be like if I reached that stage, whenever that, you know, this part of reality happens there. And in the meantime, I take refuge and endeavor to gradually, as Carl was saying, gradually shift the attachment to that which is pleasurable.
Maybe for some of the next classes, I'll do a bit of a piecemeal approach. I'll find where the simile of the raft is located, right? Where we can reflect on that a little bit. What is the raft? And we don't let go of it in the middle of the river.
I mentioned that for me, the idea of the asava of becoming really resonates. I just find myself so many times thinking, well, I need to get busy. I've got things to do, places to go. And it's like, well, I don't really have to get busy. I've constructed a world in which those seem to be, I think those are necessary, and and there's always, and basically it is me constructing this world and then living in this world and constructing it as I'm living in it. And so it comes back to that, well, the phrase you're talking about, the awareness of the process, and the process, the things it's aware of are processes too. Like the acronym SOTA Pi that one of the teachers came up with, the streams of dependent arising processes interacting. That's all everything is. And I'm kind of driving this in my own way, creating my own stream and then pulling in streams around me. And it's just, if I just calm down, and I've traveled a little bit in less developed, less technological countries, and I'm just amazed that people just sitting there relaxed, talking to each other. They don't have to get busy. They're not trying to pile up, get to the top of the corporation or get a bigger house or whatever. They're just, living their lives. And I could do that too if I would just let it happen, make that my reality instead. So I don't know, that's just something a compulsion that I notice in myself.
Ralph, I love that statement, the statements you just made. And I think many of us can relate to that. At the same time, I was thinking, isn't that better than you're creating your own world rather than everybody else is telling you what to do and pushing you and pulling you? And so my positive takeaway from what you said was, at least it's coming from within, even if it is a compulsion of some kind. That it's not from the outside where we're feeling we have to accomplish that because others want us to accomplish it, or we have to do it because somebody else demands that we do it. I don't know, I'm trying to put a positive spin on it, but I understand the concern about the compulsion too. But thank you so much, Ralph.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that's where the gatekeeping comes in. Be careful which strands you pull in and what you pay attention to.
Yeah, that's from what you two are saying. It's one thing that might help to realize is that it's not, compulsion isn't a toggle switch. It seems like there are degrees of it, and I think in terms of the ultimate goal of the path, we're compelled up to the very end, even the parts of the path, they're a form of becoming. They're positive form of becoming, but they take us to the end. So it's not like kind of what you were, I think, describing, Mark, is that there are some positive forms of kind of existence making that are part of the path. Compassion being one of them, jhana being one, gratitude. Those are positive things that we take advantage of, that we use to our benefit, that help us. So it's not that all bhava is something to avoid. If that helps to say.
I just want to make a plug for starting at the beginning, because the recordings only began at the quarantine. So we actually, there is no archive because Joe and I, we had wanted to record Carl's teachings, but it just was never, we were never able to do it pre-pandemic. So these recordings, these classes, and you all finding us has been one of the blessings of this time. But I think there were so many rich teachings and discussions from the beginning that it would be beautiful to just to begin again, and then be also recording your teachings from the beginning. That's my 2 cents.
Upon hearing that, in case my body language didn't convey my agreement sufficiently, the other thing is, I know further iterations when I hear a teaching, even if it's the exact same teaching, like pre-recorded, recorded, I get different things from it. And I imagine, Carl, if you were to consider starting again, repeating, that you might find different things that you would want to emphasize a second time through, which brings an additional richness to it. And for you too, being so generous with your time and wisdom. Thank you.
It's been another wonderful morning being with you all. Boy, I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Carl.